Hello, my name is Ria Prasha and I'll be doing my Family Law Module Code LW381 negotiation assignment and providing an option for settlement on the financial solutions that are available to both Mr. and Mrs. Booth. As such, both parties' joining issues will be discussed in hope of maintaining the amicable relationship they currently have. If both parties are willing to compromise as well as use cooperating as a key tool in this process, a fair outcome is certainly achievable for both Mr. and Mrs. Booth. From the case, it is clear that there are several key issues that will be discussed that are held in high regard by both Mr. and Mrs. Booth. Thusly, the issue shall be tackled and supported by Section 25 of the Matrimonial Causes Act 1973. Firstly, Section 25(1), the first consideration is to be given to the welfare of a minor. Section 25A, the court will have regard in the financial resources the party is likely to have in the foreseeable future. Section 23(1)(c), an order to pay a lump sum to one of the spousal parties. Section 24(1)(a), property adjustment orders. Section 25(2)(f), contributions which parties have made, and finally the grounds for divorce. It's imperative both parties are cooperative where they see fit, and as I'm working to create a settlement for both clients, I believe necessary concessions can be made in an attempt to resolve said issues for the whole Booth family within the following negotiation. The first issue at hand is who shall receive the children and on what days. While it is agreed both parties are in broad agreement that the children should be with Mrs. Booth most days, clarity is ultimately the key in achieving this. The court will abide by Section 1(3) of the Child Protection Act 1989 in considering the feelings, education, and risk of harm suffered by the child. While Zach is still only aged 5, it would be unlikely that his feelings will be taken into consideration. However, as Maddie is 15, her views towards her mother suggest she would be better off with her father, as also her grades are currently being affected by the divorce. However, as Mrs. Booth is willing to give up her time to ensure the children are surrounded by affection, attention and attention during the adjustment phase, and Mr. Booth is required to work in intense hours, it would be only fair under Section 25 of the MCA that the children reside with their mother. As Mr. Booth has already agreed, a 50-50% split is not desirable, and 70 to 30% share in favour of Mrs. Booth is achievable. Mr. Booth's key objective is to have the children every Wednesday as well as Saturday. However, Mrs. Booth cannot condone this without clarity, as she doesn't think an unstable environment is good for the kids, as well as her wanting to enroll in her Saturday yoga course. Should Mr. Booth fail to provide whether he can take the children on a Saturday, a specific issue order will be made to determine whether he will be available or not. Provided he can demonstrate this, Mrs. Booth shall allow Mr. Booth to have the children every Wednesday as well as Saturday, with either himself or his mother who lives close by. As such, the children will be able to settle into their new life and have a parent or grandparent readily available, as well as Mrs. Booth not having family close by, so the children can spend every few Saturdays with their grandmother, ensuring the closeness of their family. Furthermore, both parties have a shared interest about the finances received from 5 Glover Close. The courts will have to look into this under Section 25(2)(a), financial resources the party is likely to have in the foreseeable future. Where Mrs. Booth is adamant that she will not give Mr. Booth any money from the house, Mr. Booth feels it's fair to do so, especially as he is worried about the upkeep of maintenance fees for his children of around £400 per month. In determining the fairness of how the property should be split, White versus White tells us the nature, value, and circumstances determine whether to share the asset equally. Firstly, it must be decided whether Glover Close is a matrimonial property or a non-matrimonial property, where no fiscal gain has to be given to the opposing spouse. As the property was not left to Mr. Booth to inherit, it can be fair to say the property was non-matrimonial, regardless of them being together regardless of her receiving it during her marriage, because he was not mentioned in his mother-in-law's will. However, because of his joking with his mother-in-law about the money he would receive from the property, it does raise the idea as to whether the mother-in-law believed it would be seen as a matrimonial property for them both. Either way, Charman versus Charman states that there are reasons to depart from equality on property, whether matrimonial or not. In this case, because all the money Mrs. Booth is hoping to receive from Glover Close will go to paying the mortgage for the house, to take care of Mr. Booth's children, who will be living with her while she cares for them. Following from Charman, as Mr. Booth is worried about paying for maintenance fees without the money, JL versus SL provide that an accurate sum of money can be given only to meet the needs of the other party, and it can be and can be disproportionately split based on the instinctive feeling of the courts. This is also supported by Caudle versus Caudle, which demonstrates the courts will be concerned about if the other parent can afford housing and to provide for his children also. A resolution to this is Mrs. Booth will not accept child maintenance fees from Mr. Booth of £400 a week for the next 3 years, totalling £62,400, only after Glover Close is sold for £350,000 or over. This works in favour of both parties, as Mr. Booth will effectively have a 17.7% share of the Glover Close money by not paying maintenance for the first 3 years, as he claims the money would have gone directly to his kids, and instead the children will rely on Mrs. Booth from the Glover Close money she shall receive. As well as this, 3 years is long enough for Mrs. Booth to use this money for her mortgage and spend time with her children. Thereafter, she will be able to find work or another source of income without having given any of her mother's money to him directly. Moving on, if the previous issue is agreed on, the following issue will be clear in its purpose and its benefits, and as it benefits the entire Booth family, financially and otherwise. This will be regarding who will pay the £5,000 probate of 5 Glover Close, as well as the ownership of the joint bank account. While they both agree the joint account should be given to Mr. Booth and the probate must go through, the financial strings in between are loose. Mr. Booth believes receiving all of the joint account would be fair, as she's never contributed. However, Mrs. Booth needs at least £2,500 from the account, as well as using £2,500 from her ISA to make the payments of the £5,000 for her probate. I believe this should come from the joint savings account rather than any of Mrs. Booth's ISA. As Mrs. Booth is legally entitled to half of the £15,000, asking for £5,000 seems reasonable, as it explicitly contributes towards the living arrangements and lifestyle of her children. Although Mrs. Booth already feels bad about taking the money, it shows her real requirement for it, as she did believe the joint account should be all of Mr. Booth's, but is willing to ask for the £2,500 for the risk for her children, which I now believe should be the whole £5,000. As well as this, Mrs. Booth's wage is less than 25% of Mr. Booth's, meaning her £8,000 ISA should be preserved where it can, again to ensure she can keep up with the maintenance of her children during the first 3 years of their divorce. Section 23(1)(c) of the MCA will provide an order that either party to the marriage shall pay a lump sum, meaning Mr. Booth will be able to receive £10,000 rather than £7,500 to adequately be able to furnish his new home, and £5,000 of the account will go towards Mrs. Booth, working as a catalyst in their children's normality and routine. However, if Mr. Booth does not agree to this, then family arbitration shall be advised, although neither would be happy with the outcome, as they'd most likely receive half of the account each, which is not close to either of the parties' starting objectives. Additionally, a resolve that would also have great clarity if the parties can agree to cooperate on the suggestions already given is a division of 23 Park Way. Although Mr. Booth will no doubt agree that maintaining the family home will benefit his children the most, Mrs. Booth will most likely also agree that her sole ownership of the property does not reflect the work Mr. Booth has put in over the years. B versus B. However, in B versus B, the common basic welfare of the children will come first, even if the other parent struggles, which should be noted as it's not entirely sure whether Mrs. Booth would be able to afford a new property straight away if she had the children for more than 50% of the time. As such, taking Mr. Booth's contributions into account and reflecting the feelings of both parties that the children come first, as well as acknowledging Section 25 2F contributions which parties have made, a merger would be an ideal outcome. The regulations of which conclude Mrs. Booth will reside with the children in the family home until Zach goes to university, or failing that, at the end of his last school year in which he will turn 18. The merger will be beneficial to Mr. Booth as he does not have a pension, so will contribute massively to his later life. As well as this, Mrs. Booth is able to keep the children in her home, where they are also closer to Mr. Booth's mother, who will be able to see them more frequently during their upbringing. Mrs. Booth is now also available to stay where she is without disrupting the kids, as well as have time to make new arrangements and develop her career path. However, in discussing Section 25(2)(f) of the MCA, the contributions Mrs. Booth made for the family tie in with that demonstrated in McFarlane, where compensation should be given for what she has given up and will proceed to do for the family by only working 2 days a week. This was done to keep up with Mr. Booth's hectic schedule and so he could prosper in his work life, while she kept home life settled. Whereas, to quote, she may have achieved the same success had she not compromised her career for the sake of them all. Mrs. Booth's compensation for continuing to care for the children after the divorce, her past and current future contributions to the family will be assessed as a maintenance award. This will be done as £250 per week, totaling £1,000 per month, in which the accuracy of the given amount can be discussed in mediation after assessing maintenance requirements. This is only a fifth of Mr. Booth's maintenance, well-paid job, which is a seemingly small amount for Mrs. Booth, taking upon the responsibility of ultimately childcare and the loss of her career. Lastly, the grounds for the divorce must be agreed to start any of the process moving forward, as Section 2 of the MCA 1973, the court shall not hold the marriage have broken down irretrievably unless a petitioner satisfies the court. It has been mutually agreed that adultery would not be an acceptable reasoning, as Mr. Booth is adamant he shall not concede to it, and Mrs. Booth in the wider perspective also does not want adultery to be the real grounds for divorce. As such, Mrs. Booth will file for the grounds of unreasonable behaviour under Section 2B of the Matrimonial Causes Act. This will be most sensible in this case, as both broadly agree that adultery would not have been illegal. This will be most sensible, even though in this case Mrs. Booth could have filed for adultery, as even though Mr. Booth claimed against it, he still had a sexual relationship. To conclude, if Mr. Booth and Mrs. Booth are agreed upon to resolve, if Mr. and Mrs. Booth are agreed upon the resolve of the previously stated issues, I believe the divorce process shall be eased for both parties. However, any settlement reached today is preliminary, and final approval must be agreed upon by both clients before being sent to the court.